Welcome everybody, good to have you with us tonight. Philip, 4 years ago, how well could you see?
Jenny, I couldn't see very well at all. I had a growth, there was a failure of the stem cells, and so like a veil, the covering on my iris was gradually coming down in an opaque sense.
And this was your right eye?
It was my right eye, and things were getting dimmer and dimmer.
Now, you had to retire early because of this, is that right?
Yes, I did, and then I subsequently went back to work.
Tell us what you had done to your right eye in 2010.
I had my cornea scraped off, and then I had stem cells that were taken from my left eye and grown up by a very talented medical researcher sitting next to me and a team of other capable people, put onto my right eye, whereupon I grew a new cornea in my right eye.
And how well can you see now?
I can see you very well. I can see you wearing 2 earrings. I can see you holding a pen. I can see everything.
And you've gone back to work?
I did go back to work, but last year I retired seriously.
Nick, you're the researcher who was involved in this. Explain what you did to help Philip.
So basically what we did was we took multiple biopsies, and these are like 1 millimetre in diameter from his healthy eye, and we put these biopsies on contact lenses, and we put those lenses in a solution and put those lenses in an incubator so that we could expand the cells from those tiny biopsies. And once those contact lenses became confluent with cells, and Stephanie Watson, who performed the surgery, she was able to scrape away all the abnormal cells from Philip's right eye with a scalpel blade, and then we rested that contact lens with the stem cells over that eye.
So you'd grown that and basically put it on the
Exactly.
eye. Was this all part of a clinical trial?
It was a clinical trial which was registered. It had undergone ethics approval from 2 authorities, the University of New South Wales and the Area Health Service, Prince of Wales Hospital.
Well, how quickly did you notice the difference?
I noticed it quickly enough so that by the time I went down to the south coast for a bit of a break, I sat down and I read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo without leaving the chair.
How long was that after the operation?
That was probably 2 days later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Martin Perry, you're the head of Stem Cells Australia, which is a government-funded research initiative. Explain to people how stem cells can help regrow or repair parts of the body.
So stem cells are special cells. They exist in many tissues of the body, and they are able to what we call self-renew, that's divide to form more stem cells. But they're also capable of what we call differentiation or specialization to give rise to mature cell types. They're like a reserve or reservoir for regeneration and repair of the bodies.
Okay, so you can harvest them and potentially use them to treat all sorts of things.
That's correct. And we can make stem cells from embryos, or we can convert adult cells now into cells that have properties very like embryonic stem cells, and they can turn into all the tissues of the body.
So most things are experimental. They're not proven yet.
Yes, that's exactly right. So most of the stem cell treatments we're talking about are still experimental, meaning we don't yet know whether they're safe and effective in humans.
Carrie Pothast, you won gold for Australia at the 2000 Olympics in beach volleyball. What state were your knees in after 20 years of playing volleyball?
They were in pretty bad state, actually, Jenny. I'd had 6 knee surgeries that involved ligament ruptures, reconstructions, meniscus tears, cartilage pulled off bones. So I had almost everything you could do to a knee I did over those 20 years, and I just kept on playing because I loved what I was doing.
So how did you end up being treated with stem cells? How did that happen?
Well, I got approached by Dr. Bright, his offices, Macquarie Stem Cells, and I kind of put my hand up and said, yes, I'd be interested in having that done for sure. He was very clear that it doesn't work for everybody, but I wanted to have a go because I was at the point where I was just going downhill.
Did you know it was experimental?
I knew it was being tried, and I knew it was kind of at the beginning of the procedures, that he'd only been doing it for a couple of years.
And what was the treatment itself like?
Well, the initial treatment to remove the fat that which they took the stem cells from, which was basically liposuction, wasn't pleasant, and that's not a very pleasant experience.
Ralph Bright, you're a cosmetic surgeon.
Yes.
And you administered Kerry's fat stem cell treatment. You contacted her. Why did you contact her?
The imperative at that time was to help people to become more aware of the existence of stem cells and of the possibility of having this sort of treatment.
But was it because she's a high-profile Olympian and you were keen to have someone like that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So did she pay for the treatment or was it free?
It's free.
Did you pay? No. Okay. Ralph, you were the first person in Australia to treat osteoarthritis with fat stem cells. How did you get started doing this, working with fat stem cells? What motivated you as a cosmetic surgeon to start doing it?
I'd been doing fat transfer for many, many years, since about 2000. And one of the patients at that time had had a melanoma excised and it looked so darn ugly. And I said, look, don't worry, you've just got a hole there where there's no fat, so I'll just put some fat in there for you. And the first time I did it, because I needed to do it 3 times to build up the depth, and the first time I did it, she had no feeling whatsoever. The second time I did it, she said, ouch, and the third time I had to use local anesthetic. And I said, what is in fat that this person should regrow all their nerves? And that's when I started to look at fat and to try and find out what was in it. And then I saw the work of Bill Walsh at Prince of Wales, and he was growing bone from fat. And I thought that was pretty amazing.
Kerry, what happened after your treatment?
I'm 1 year almost to the date now since I had the procedure, and my knees are unbelievably fantastic, and I couldn't say that highly enough. Because an example, just this week I was at Australia Zoo with my 7-year-old. We were walking around for 4 hours. I had him on my back at times because he was tired. I then jumped on a plane and came back to Sydney, and I had no pain, no stiffness, and 18 months ago I would have been in pain and having to take anti-inflammatories and probably wouldn't have been able to walk that much.
Clint Bartram, you recently had to retire from AFL because of knee problems. We're going to hear a bit about knees tonight. How did you find out about stem cell therapy, about fat stem cell therapy? And I should define this because there are different types of stem cell therapy. How did you find out about this?
Yeah, I was at a very similar point to Kerry, where my career was being halted by injuries. This very similar story. I had about 6 or 7 arthroscopes, which led to the fact that I actually couldn't perform the way I wanted to. The options were either retire, again very similar, or get a partial knee replacement. That wasn't really an option as a 24-year-old, so a club doctor, Dan Bates, came to me with another option, which was stem cells, of which I was explained that this procedure still is experimental, but it was something that, I mean, as a professional athlete, you love what you do, and that was something that I was really passionate about, giving myself the best opportunity to potentially get back and play football.
Now, again, did you pay for this, or because you're a high-profile footballer, were you approached to have it done? Like, how did that work?
So the football club fully supports all their players that are in the system.
Okay, so do you know if they paid for it?
No, I'm unaware.
Okay. What were the results like?
So I've had partial success. The biggest difference I've actually noticed is day to day. For me, I never used to be able to walk without pain. If I was on my feet for more than half an hour, my knee would blow up and create quite a lot of swelling. Was it enough to get back to playing AFL football? Certainly not. But the success that I did have was enough to give me a really comfortable life now, where I still can be relatively active. So I'm pretty impressed with what the stem cells have actually done.
Okay. Ross Walker, your knees were a bit like Kerry and Clint's,
Yep.
although you weren't a professional athlete.
Not in the slightest.
No, not in the slightest. How did you hear about fat stem cell therapy?
Okay, well, I was one of those fools that played soccer and squash until I was 52. And I have a radio show every week, and I was interviewing Professor Ben Herbert, who's from Regenius. about regenerative medicine. So
which is a company that deals with stem cells.
So I have a segment on the show called Regenerative Medicine. I interview Ben every week, and I've been doing that for the last 3 years. As a doctor, I thought, yes, this is an experimental therapy. Yes, the evidence on the preliminary work has been reasonable. And so I went ahead and had it done because I didn't want to be accused of cells for comment. I paid for it myself. It cost me $10,000 and it did nothing.
Didn't work at all?
Not at all. But let me say in defence of the technique, I was told by Dr. Kwa, who did the technique, he wasn't confident because my knee was so bad that I actually did need a replacement, but I'm too young for that. So it didn't work for me at all.
And you're a cardiologist.
I am.
Did you have any misgivings about having a treatment that was experimental?
It's my own cells. They took 200 grams of abdominal fat. I tried to negotiate for a little bit more. And they harvested about 70 million stem cells and injected them back in my knee. And it was my cells, so I thought at the worst it wasn't going to work and I'd lose $10,000. At the best, I'd be out of pain.
Donald Kwa in Thredbo, you work with the biggest stem cell company in Australia. You are also Ross's doctor. Why do you offer fat stem cell treatment when it's still experimental?
Well, I suppose there's different degrees of experimental, and that's important to note. There are at least 20 clinical trials available on the use of cell therapy in osteoarthritis. I'm not sure as certain about other fields. In virtually all of them, they've been safe and there have been positive results, and on multiple of those studies, there have been MRI findings or arthroscopic findings to show that there have been positive improvements. What some in the panel may want is really a level 1 study where there's double-blinded randomized controlled trials. And now, there are a lot of treatments in medicine that haven't had level 1 studies passed and are still being done. I think it really comes down to whether it is safe, and I believe it is safe. There was a paper come out in 2011 which was a meta-analysis, which means someone sits down and looks at all the studies with respect to stem cell use, and there were 24 studies from memory in that paper, and the conclusion was that it was safe.
Are you involved in clinical trials in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been involved in a publication of a pre-clinical trial that was published in August 2012, looking at the secretions of the cells, because we believe that a lot of the work is done by the secretions. We're also involved in the largest and the only one in the world of an ethics-approved registry. So a lot of these clinical published papers that I spoke about have got numbers of 12 and 20 and 30 patients in their cohort. We've got now over 400 patients in that cohort over 2 years. Many of those studies were 6 to 12 months.
What are your results showing in terms of the effectiveness of the treatment?
Well, we're showing, so certainly in about 75% of patients, they get pain relief at 6 and 12 months. And that pain relief on average is about 70 to 80%. So we rated patients as responders only if they improved by at least 30% with pain.
Okay. Martin Perra, do you think there's solid evidence of the proven effectiveness of some of these stem cell treatments?
I think in terms of osteoarthritis, the evidence is still equivocal. Some studies find benefits, some do not. This is why we need to do these carefully controlled trials, where we observe the patients very carefully over a long period of time to really get an idea whether the treatment is safe and effective.
John Rasko, what do you think? You specialise in bone marrow transplants, which is an established area of stem cell treatment. What do you think about this kind of treatment?
Well, we know that you do anything to a knee and 30% of people tend to get a little bit better, 30% of people tend to get a little bit worse, and the other 30% remain pretty well neutral, and God knows what happens to the other 10%.
I think that
the bottom line is that we don't know what happens when we inject these cells or any different types of cells until such time as we do a randomised trial.
Ralph, what did you want to say?
Just to make the point that if you are seeing cartilage growing on X-rays and MRIs, then it's hardly placebo.
But you don't know that. You don't know that unless you've got a placebo arm. You know, I mean, I think I'm also concerned about the use of payment for treatment in this sort of situation. A clinical trial should not have a cost involved in it. And I think it's a very grey area of ethics, personally.
But if you could ever see a placebo that's going to grow cartilage, have you ever seen a placebo grow cartilage?
I don't think that's... I think the issue is that we need to know that it is of benefit for these patients. And if you're charging people for it, yes, but no.
But if someone had said to me, $20,000 and your knees will be like they feel today, I would have no hesitation in doing the procedure.
Not everyone can afford 20,000, Kerry, of course.
I agree with you.
And
I
so,
agree with
you know, I think we need to know whether...
And I think
works.
the point is, the point you're making is about science, right? That you want the science.
We want the science without the overcrowding of financial incentive involved in it, I think.
And do you share that view, Martin, that you don't think the science is in on fat stem cell therapy or other types of stem cell therapy being offered in Australia as well?
Most types of stem cell therapy are still experimental. We don't know, in fact, in many cases whether they're safe. We don't know in many cases whether they're effective.
And so how can it be that those therapies are being applied to people?
Because they are exempt from the normal regulations that govern cell therapies in this country. And
that's because you're allowed to use
a patient's own cells. Yes. And may I point out that the application you've heard here, fat cells for osteoarthritis, is one a lot of us would agree is a reasonable thing to try. But what's being done goes well beyond that now. And
so do you see that as a loophole in the law?
I do.
You do? And why are you concerned about it being a loophole in the law?
Because it opens the door to a whole range of treatments and manipulations that, in fact, may carry real risk and really represent a genuine danger.
Okay, Donald, what did you want to say? I mean, this idea that there's a loophole in the law that's enabling you to use this treatment.
Well, it's not a loophole. It's the same as that loophole that he refers to. I think John or Martin might have mentioned that, is a biological exemption. It is the same as someone saying that blood transfusion is a biological exemption.
Ralph, how do you respond to the suggestion you're operating in a loophole?
Oh, yeah. Good point. The loophole, the word loophole, is a word that comes from Martin, and it's not shared by the TGA. The TGA made a very deliberate decision to exempt these cells. It endorses the low-risk nature of the cells that we use, as opposed to the high-risk nature of embryonic stem cells and the like.
John, you're sitting next to Kerry. I mean, she's saying this worked for me.
Absolutely, and I'm certain it did. However, what I would say is maybe injecting plasma or normal saline or washing out the joint might have had just exactly the same benefit in another group of people or herself. The point is not to have celebrity endorsements or individual reports. Ultimately, we want to apply the best health we possibly can in our nation to everybody who has a crook joint. And everybody should be allowed to take the benefit of the best that medicine and science has to offer. That's what Australia's health system offers, and that's what we all wish to provide.
Martin, are your own stem cells safer to use in these procedures? I mean, is safety proven?
That depends.
As opposed to effectiveness?
If we take the example of a red cell transfusion, that's an example in which the patient's own cells are taken, they're not really manipulated much, and they're put right back in to do exactly the same job they would normally be doing. Now, in instances where we take a patient's own cells and manipulate them in the laboratory or grow them, and then we're putting them back to do a completely different job, that entails a good deal more risk. So there's a spectrum of risks here, unquestionably. And yes, you do have to look at the risk-benefit analysis. But the problem is, under the current regulatory framework, this is allowing experimentation to go forward without the appropriate oversight.
Just because we don't know the science behind it doesn't mean to say that it doesn't work.
Response?
That's the definition of pseudoscience, right there. We just heard the definition of pseudoscience.
But science isn't absolute either.
That is snake oil sales.
So far we've talked about stem cell treatment in Australia. Christy, I wanted to talk to you because you travelled to Russia to have a bone marrow stem cell transplant to try and stop your multiple sclerosis. And your story was recently featured on 60 Minutes. We have some footage of you before and after your treatment. Let's have a look at that. And you might want to just tell us about that. So your mobility was limited here?
It was, I'm getting upset watching it. It was very limited. That was my day-to-day, that was me after. So obviously my hair's missing there. That was me after I got back from Russia. I could get back into exercise and no longer needed mobility devices.
Tell us what you had done in Russia. What was involved?
I had an haematopoietic stem cell transplant, which is essentially the same as a bone marrow transplant that they've been doing for cancers for many, many years. And it involved stimulating the bone marrow so that they could collect it, and then chemotherapy and reinfusion of the stem cells to reboot my immune system. The whole idea behind it is that MS is widely accepted to be a hematologically rooted autoimmune disease. So the idea behind it is to stop that autoimmune process with the chemotherapy and rebuild a brand new immune system that no longer attacks your brain and your spinal cord.
And why did you have it done in Russia?
Because I couldn't get into Sydney. So I applied to all of the reputable facilities I could find overseas, the ones that had contributed to clinical trials and who I knew were good.
John, you're doing the only trial in Australia on this kind of treatment. How experimental do you think it is for MS patients?
Well, I think the rationale is solid, but there is no randomised trial in MS, I can say up front, as opposed to other conditions. We initiated a trial at St Vincent's this is our fourth trial, but in 2010, including multiple sclerosis, given that by that stage we felt there was enough evidence to start looking at it. So we've treated 9 patients, and it has been difficult to include all the patients that we'd like to include, but for us, we felt, first of all, we wanted to make sure it was safe.
So when you hear Christy's story about going and you see that footage, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I suppose I'd like to be able to offer Christy that in Australia, and we did have a conversation before she went. And but
so she wanted to be in your trial.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
and you wouldn't. You didn't.
Well, no,
include
but
her.
the way it's been approved by our ethics committee is that the patients have to have failed multiple lines of therapy, and that's pretty standard, really. When you think about this is a procedure that has a 5% chance of dying. And so we only accept patients that neurologists feel have no other therapeutic options.
So you thought she hadn't tried enough other
Well, I have to be abided by the ethics committee, and so by the way the trial was set up, I couldn't accept her in the trial.
And Christy, why did you leapfrog that process of trying the other drugs and trying the other procedures?
I found a number of studies which showed a median success rate of around 80%, but a success rate of over 90% in the patients who had early intervention, AHSCT.
So you wanted to get in early.
I wanted to get in, and I wanted to have the high success rate. And I didn't want to waste time. I was out of work. I couldn't work as an ED nurse anymore. So I didn't want to waste years becoming more disabled and trialling multiple drugs with side effects and risks.
I want you to talk to one another here, because I'm really interested. Really interested in this because you know,
we did talk to each other.
We did.
I'm sure you did.
I was actually very surprised because before I went to Russia, Dr. Maud did give me the privilege of a phone call that was lengthy, and he was very sympathetic, and I was very frustrated, and we discussed that there were some trials in which early intervention patients did better, and he explained his position in having to treat the most disabled. So it was a good phone conversation, but obviously I would have preferred to have stayed in Australia.
Yeah.
See, this is interesting to me because in all these stories, there's the meeting of science and the patient, and you've got the patient saying, I want to try something. I've got a disease. you know, that I am concerned about the development of. I want to move fast. I want to do something quickly, which is really understandable.
But Jenny, if we'd gone in quickly 15 years ago and done people early and some of them had died, then everyone would say we haven't followed due process. And so, you know, there's two sides to the story.
We've got to balance the need for science versus the human condition.
And how do you all think that balance is going at the moment?
Well, it's not going very well. When I undertook my stem cell transplant, I made sure that it was a clinical trial in the public system and under the review of an ethics committee. You know, heaven forbid we should find a doctor out there practicing with some God complex, and we have all of these things set up to protect us. And self-regulation in the medical profession is not good, Jenny.
Ralph, your response to that? Because you are able to just do this, aren't you? I mean, you don't have to prove to anyone that you know, have scientifically examined the whole process.
Sometimes we practice medicine and we see things happen and we say, oh, why did that happen? And if I do it again, will it happen again? And quite often we really don't know why we have got some improvement, but just because we don't know the science behind it doesn't mean to say that it doesn't work.
Response?
Well, that's the definition of pseudoscience right there. We just heard the definition of pseudoscience.
But science isn't absolute either.
quackery,
Science
is
isn't
snake oil
definitive.
sales.
Science isn't always definitive either.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely.
Science is not always definitive, and we can never speak in absolutes. But what we can be clear about is whether there's a benefit. And the only way to do that is with a placebo-controlled, randomised, often crossover trial, a technically approved and well-regulated trial that's then published, subject to review and replicated elsewhere. If cowboys have activities in their own rooms and do things that aren't being supervised and certainly not intended or approved by the TGA, the activities that are occurring in a number of doctors' premises were not intended by the exemption order.
So cowboys?
Absolutely.
Are there cowboys in this room?
Absolutely, I'm afraid so. This is an unproven therapy for which people are taking money, and I take exception to that.
But it's easy just to sit there and go, oh, if you were the one sitting in a wheelchair or couldn't move yourself, or you couldn't do anything with your kids or couldn't stand up, what would you do?
So thank you.
Would you be okay, this is the law and this is how it all works? Would you not just go, I'm going to try something?
I have no pleasure in being placed in the position that I find myself tonight. Overall and above everything must be compassion and respect for individuals to decide on their own course. And I find myself after 25, 30 years devoting myself to making certain that stem cells and gene therapy one day will be safely and properly administered to people. I find myself in an impossible situation appearing to be saying, don't do it.
But everything takes so long. They do these trials and they take like 20 years.
And no money for clinical trials in Australia.
But are stem cells a solution for everything? We just talk about stem cells as though they're a silver bullet. And I think that's where we have to take a step back, and that's why we need clinical trials. We need to understand whether HSCT will work for MS. We can't just lump everything together and think that stem cells are going to save everything.
Megan, you've looked at patient expectations around stem cell therapy, haven't you? What have you found?
Well, in our research, we interviewed Australians who've been overseas, and a lot of people feel really good about having done that, having gone overseas. And I think the feeling of empowerment to feel as though they have tried all options, even though there wasn't necessarily a physical improvement, they felt better for having gone. It gave them hope.
Mike, you have MS. Yes. Have you been tossing up what to do and thinking about, I mean, when you see Christy's story, for example, or when you hear about these treatments, what's been your response?
I guess I'm a little bit more sceptical. One thing I would ask Christy is, how long had you been diagnosed, Christy, had MS when you had your treatment?
I've had MS for a long time, but I went on undiagnosed for a long time. It took a severe deterioration for me to actually go into the GP and say, I think I have MS, refer me to a neuro. Yeah. But in hindsight, I had blindness in my eye in 2007. My history is extensive, and that's a common misconception after 60 minutes, is that I got MS one day and went and had a stem cell transplant. I was diagnosed and then had a stem cell transplant very quickly because I did nothing but research for 6 months and called good doctors and spoke to reputable people. But yeah, I had MS for a long time.
Jodie, you have MS too, and you're waiting to hear if you get into John's trial. Is that right?
I'm hoping I get into John's trial because I'd love to come have treatment in Sydney.
Yes, I was going to say, you could do very good opportunity for some lobbying here. What have you done in the meantime, though, while you're waiting?
Well, I've actually had MS diagnosed for 14 and a half years. It's been a yearly relapse for me, and I've been through every single disease-modifying drug that's available on the market. And now, that's including chemotherapy over 2 years, which was amazing for me and put me into a remission of 2 to 3 years. Now I'm at the point where I've got nothing left to lean on, and I need something. I need some hope and a light at the end of the tunnel. I saw the 60-minute program.
This was about Christy going to Russia.
About Christy. I was alerted to it by a lot of friends and relatives. When I watched it, I was sceptical at first because, you know, you hear about these miracle cures.
So have you booked in to go to Russia?
I'm booked in to go to Russia in January because I'm trying to get into Sydney. But
no pressure, John.
No pressure.
No pressure. And what is the quality of your...
I'll pay you.
Yeah, that's the issue. I have 80 Australians going to Russia in the next 18 months. 80 people that I've helped with applications, and I've I've responded to 37,000 emails in 4 months. And I have 12,000 in my account right now that are not replied to.
How much does it cost?
It costs $40,000 US plus expenses, airfares and carers and that sort of thing.
How do you know it was the transplant that resulted in your improvement?
From February till I arrived in Moscow in August, I got progressively worse. I tried steroids in hospital. They didn't work. I just kept getting worse and worse and more disabled. After I returned from Moscow, I waited at least 4 months to have an MRI because I didn't want anyone to say it was the steroids interfering with my MRI report. All of my lesions are smaller and 2 are no longer visible on MRI. They cannot find them. And
these are lesions in your brain?
Lesions in my brain. And a placebo effect cannot remove MRI lesions or shrink the ones that are there.
Do you think there could be another explanation, though, for why you've improved since you went to Russia? I mean, do you think there could be... Because MS symptoms can wax and wane, can't they?
They can wax and wane, go. But they usually wax and wane for at the most maybe 2 months.
Is it better for you the earlier you go before...
Some of the data that I found said yes.
But over here, it's basically you've got to be at death's door, then we might have a look at you.
That's right. And the facility that's doing the stage 3 clinical trials, they have trial criteria that's very similar. They want people to have failed these drugs, but they also have a non-trial acceptance policy. And I was accepted off trial. I'm fine to be off trial. I just want the right to be treated.
But it's $200,000 to do that with the Chicago group.
So that's why I went with it.
But so what I'm trying to do, so you talk about the difference between compassion and science. What I'm trying to do is, I don't want to accept the $200,000. What I want to do is go through the appropriate channels, and I have, through the bureaucracy, and it goes to a health minister's meeting on the 18th of July. I've wrote a document. I'm trying to get it done so that we have an even playing field and not everyone has to pay too much.
So this will be available in Australia.
And people paying money for it, I don't think is the right way to go. If I can get the authorities to pay for it, I would love that.
So does that mean you have evidence it works? Scientific evidence it works?
There is plenty of evidence that it works, correct, but we need the randomised trial, and that's why we have committed at St Vincent's to do the randomised trial. And it will cost us to do that, but we want to do it because we want to know that the science is correct.
But do you understand how frustrating
Absolutely.
that is for people who don't care who pays? I don't care if I pay or I don't care if the taxpayer pays. I just want my wife to be better again.
Correct. I do. I listen to it daily, and I do feel for people.
Why in the trial? Why do we have to be at a certain disability range? I mean, what is the point of waiting, say, to be non-mobile before you get the treatment to halt your MS? I don't understand the logic behind that. Nobody in their right mind wants to halt their MS when they're already in a wheelchair.
Because there are therapies that may work. And I mean,
But I've been
obviously
on every
clear
one
like
of your
every thera- Absolutely. So you may be eligible, but there are people who may go on to interferon, for instance, and be fined for many years.
But it sounds like there's a reasonable basis for believing that this procedure should be available in Australia, that's being offered, that Christy had to go to Russia for.
Yes, Jenny, I hope the State Health Minister's watching for it.
Ralph, back in your surgery in Sydney, what other conditions are you treating with fat stem cell therapy?
I think that osteoarthritis responds very well, and I think that migraine is another disease that also shows an extremely promising response rate, and that's something that I would like to progress.
You're also treating, though, spinal cord injury, MS, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, all with fat stem cell therapy, is that right?
I have had some patients with Parkinson's disease, and I think that overall I'm not convinced that it's the best treatment to have.
Well, you've treated Jeffrey up the back
yes,
here, yes?
And I'm very happy with his response, but I think that he's a little bit unusual.
Jeffrey, how did the treatment go?
I had the initial extraction of the stem cells in December 2011. Within 2 weeks, I noticed an improvement in my connectivity with the world around me, my vitality, and I subsequently had top-up treatments several times, and the tremor in my right arm was almost pretty well disappeared, and neither of them have come back. I've since written a novel which has been published, so my cognitive abilities didn't deteriorate any more than they do in any other 70-year-old. I'm happy I had the treatment.
Okay, Martin, your reaction?
Well, we don't really know what would happen to stem cells under those circumstances, or they're not pure stem cells, obviously. It's a crude preparation of fat. It seems unlikely to me that they would reach the brain and be able to benefit Parkinson's disease.
John, your reaction?
I couldn't be more thrilled for Jeffrey. I couldn't be more thrilled for Christy. So without wanting to dramatise it then, Jenny, you know, a person who might, with MS, have a life expectancy of 10 or 15 years being with their children and seeing their kids grow up, might die with a 5% or higher risk in the first 3 months following that autologous transplant.
But the worldwide risk rate is about 1% of treatment-related mortality. The doctor who did mine has done 280 transplants with 0 deaths. So we have to look at different facilities, and we can't just say it's 5%, because that's absolutely not true. It may be 5% in Sydney, I don't know, but it's not 5% in every location in the world.
Okay. Donald, you wanted to say something. Did you want to join in this discussion?
I suppose I wanted to address an earlier comment about cowboys, and for fear of being labelled as a cowboy, I want to point out that I have to be referred patients by other doctors. I have to write back to those doctors explaining my rationale for treatment and what I've told the patients. I also work under the auspices of a medical advisory committee of the hospital that I perform this procedure at. So we have many treatments in the medical field which would be deemed experimental that are commonplace, and I can name quite a few, certainly in musculoskeletal medicine.
I want to talk a little bit about the placebo effect, because I don't think we can, have this discussion without talking about that. Donald, in the absence of those studies, those trials that actually do things like establish what happens when people are given a placebo, how can you know that some of the outcomes you get aren't the placebo effect? That people aren't just responding to any kind of treatment?
There's no doubt that there's a strong placebo effect. There have been other trials that have shown that the more that you do, the more that you interfere, the more that you treat someone, the greater the placebo effect. I suppose when you look at things like cartilage regrowth, changes in biomarkers, so for example, where we can look and measure products of cartilage degradation, in placebo group and in treatment groups, and there was a difference in that North Shore trial.
Martin, what about where things are measurable? Can you, like the growth of cartilage, can you eliminate the placebo effect with treatments?
I think it's important to recognize that there may be a placebo effect, but also physically manipulating the tissue, putting a needle in, may do things we don't really appreciate that could be a consequence of those manipulations. So that's why it's important to know precisely what is causing the beneficial effect. So the treatment has to be matched as closely to a control as possible.
Jeffrey, have you wondered about the placebo effect with treatment or not?
Yes, I have. And my view was, if it works in me, then I don't care whether it's placebo effect or
what it is.
If I feel better, it's now 3.5 years, and I do still feel better. I still enjoy red and white wine. I can do things that I wasn't able to do prior to 2011.
Kerry, did you wonder about it?
I don't think it even crossed my mind because I'd been in pain for so many years while I was playing, and then since retiring, I retired 10 years ago, that I've tried everything, and I've had injections in my joint before. I've had
a lot of treatment.
I've had a lot of treatment, and it took a while for me to really believe that it had worked. It took 6 months for me to really start to test it, and now I'm running on the sand, and I didn't even run on the sand when I was playing.
Ross, what about you? You were a bit more sceptical about...
No, look, there's no doubt about the placebo response. A study came out last year about arthroscopy for osteoarthritis, and they did sham arthroscopy and a proper arthroscopy where they tidied up the joints. There was absolutely no difference in benefit with a significant placebo response by just having the anaesthetic and having the injection.
Matt, you've also been overseas for stem cell treatment for your spinal cord injury. Where did you go?
I went to Germany.
Now, that clinic you went to has since been shut down, is that right? Perry, you're hopeful that stem cell therapy eventually might help your spinal cord injury. What sort of treatment have you had so far?
Yeah, I've taken part in a clinical trial with human embryonic stem cells in India. It was a trial for people that were incurable and terminal, and I've been doing that for a few years now, and seen functional recovery that haven't been able to explain by my Australian doctors. So
what sort of things?
Mainly my function of my diaphragm. So I was injured playing rugby 20 years ago. My life expectancy was 10 years post-injury because I was fully ventilated. So about 14 years after my injury, I went to India to get treatment and started to regain function in my diaphragm. The last series of treatment, I started to get a bit of function in my right shoulder, so...
Has it been as much as you'd hoped in terms of a...
Well, I went into the treatment thinking, any improvement would be amazing because there is no cure for a spinal cord injury at the moment. That's pretty obvious.
So how many times have you been?
5, 6 times probably, yeah.
And how many more times do you think you'll go?
Well, at this stage, it's all about, money because I have to pay to take part in that clinical trial, and it's not cheap.
So you have to pay in addition to the travel costs? You have to pay as well? How much has it cost you so far?
Be within the vicinity of maybe... It's going to get me in my wheelchair. Probably $250,000, I'd say.
$250,000?
Yep.
How do they administer the treatment,
IV injection, iron.
This is embryonic stem cells?
Yeah, human embryonic, intramuscular, epidural, all sorts of... Yeah.
Thank you.
Martin, what's your view of this treatment?
There are trials now ongoing of embryonic stem cell derived products in spinal cord injury. And we don't know how those trials will turn out.
Matt, you've also been overseas for stem cell treatment for your spinal cord injury. Where did you go?
I went to Germany, and I went there because they used my own stem cells.
So the nature of the treatment was very different, yeah?
Yeah, yep. I didn't want to put something in my body that wasn't my own.
And what were the results for you?
Yeah, not much. Nothing really happened. But if I didn't go, I'd still be sitting in here going, what about if I did go?
Now, that clinic you went to has since been shut down, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. They put some cells into a young child's brain and they didn't work out.
And the child died?
Yeah.
So where has that left you now in terms of what you're prepared to try?
Now I wouldn't really try anything unless I was like a proven deal.
So what's it like for you listening to this discussion tonight?
Yeah, I see everyone's point of view, but, you know, go in public and you worry about wetting your pants. And as a man, you know, it's devastating. If there's only a touch of hope, you'll go. And that's never going to change. I can speak to someone who's had a spinal cord injury tomorrow and tell him my experience, but he's going to have some hope because where he is at the moment is probably not the best place he'd want to be, so, yeah.
Perry, there was a lot of hype around stem cell treatment for spinal cord injuries some years ago. There was a lot of hope, a lot of, you know, promise in that, particularly during the period that Christopher Reeve was championing it and calling for more research funds and so on. Has there been much progress, do you think, in the research in that time?
Well, there's a lot more. Well, there's clinical trials happening, you know, all over the world now. So, you know, we eventually got to a point where it started to come to fruition that, you know, things were happening, there was momentum being gained. So I believe that, you know, we're on the right track now. There's things, you know, happening in the US that look encouraging. So we are on the right track. The essence of this story is that if I sit around and wait for the government to fund the doctor that's going to cure me, I'll probably be dead. So that's just the raw truth.
John?
I again feel very uncomfortable in this corner, but the question is simply how would you know whether you got a benefit or not, unless it was done in the context of a controlled clinical trial.
Nick, what's happened to the trials that you're doing around stem cell therapy for eye problems?
Well, I'm saddened, to tell you the truth, because we never got funding from the federal government, despite putting many rounds of grants in. We did get funded by the Australian Stem Cell Centre at the time, which provided a few $100,000, and the University of New South Wales chipped in $50,000. So, you know, there was a money constraint and a time constraint on us because we only had ethics committee approval for 5 years. The results show that 60% or 65% of our patients have improvement in eye health and, importantly, improvement in vision. So it's not foolproof, but certainly a large majority of our patients have benefited.
So where are you up to? Are you finished
we can't
with your work?
progress any further. What we want to do is we want to try and improve the therapy and get it out there, but we can't without funding.
Is the federal government's new medical research fund going to make a difference to any of this? Who'd like to comment on that? People running at 1,000,000 miles an hour backwards on that question. I'm wondering why. John?
Doctor visits to make 20 billion or whatever they said.
It'll take a lot of doctor visits,
yes.
a lot of co-payments to
Yeah,
make
I
up
mean,
the money.
I think it's ludicrous, personally. I think it's a smokescreen, that medical research fund. I'd love if it happened, but I don't think it'll happen.
What do you think, John?
I embrace any medical research funding, and if the government is actually committed to providing $20 billion in the years forward and making it accessible in the next couple of years, I certainly would encourage them to pursue that at the highest level.
Nick, what do you think?
Show us the money.
I agree. I think it's a great idea. I think this is one thing Australia can't do is build cars, obviously. So we have to do something with our kids. We've got to educate them. They've got to be educated that Australia's got the nous to lead the world in medical research. And if we sit by and just wait for every other country to, you know, go and make amazing breakthroughs, we'll get left behind at making cars and medical research. we've got an opportunity here to invest in medical research and put ourselves on the map.
What I want to do is wrap up and just get a final comment from people about the message they'd like to get out to people watching this. And what's the message you'd like to get out to people, Martin?
I think from a scientific point of view, we're very optimistic about this field. I think that the progress we have made has been remarkable. I'm delighted to see clinical trials proceeding. I understand everything we've heard here, but we do have a responsibility not to raise false hope and responsibility to do no harm.
Christy?
I would like Australian neurologists to see the success stories coming back from overseas and to perhaps open their minds a little bit and work with haematologists to make this more accessible in Australia.
Matt?
I would like Australia just to hurry up. Pretty much it, and get it happening now. I've already waited. You know, when I had my accident, it was 08, and it was all new then. That was the thing. You know, I thought, honestly, 6 years later, there would be something more happening than what's going on.
So hurry up.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much for joining us for this discussion tonight. That is all we have time for here. But of course, you can keep talking on Twitter and Facebook. I'm very interested to hear what you think about our discussion here tonight.